He felt cold and emptiness as suffocating waves of the great ocean closed over his consciousness, as if it was the last shore of life. Everything froze around him, the void, but nothing ended. Only the myriad interconnected probabilities and possibilities were tearing apart. He was not ready for this, any time, but not now. Usually he carefully prepared his body and mind for the transition through the warp. But this time everything happened suddenly. The void ship did not accept him. He struggled with all his might to expel the parasite from his circulatory system. This time he fell into the warp and emerged a minute later. That minute was enough for Margus Sihanouk to feel his soul torn by thousands of claws and then immediately stitched back together, patch by patch. The sorcerer fell to his knees and clenched a handful of earth. He vomited a black, oily liquid. Destruction! There is movement upwards. The search elevates above the ashes. Pain gives life. He whispered the sacred mantra from Lorgar's book and rose. For several weeks now he had been trying to tame the harsh nature of the origins of the universe. But to do this he needed to find the core. The task was complicated because after prolonged warp jumps, the void ship accumulated new layers of rocky skin. Cultists whispered that the ship had turned into a labyrinth and was constantly rebuilding itself. This seemed true, for it was becoming increasingly difficult for the word-bearer to find his way to the Temple of Knowledge. After some time, he came to the edge of an unexplored level, where dozens of initiates awaited him. The cultists planted the stocks of their stubbers and lasguns into the ground and knelt at the sight of the word-bearer. Following him were two massive figures. Margus leaned on his staff and with a dry, abrupt gesture sent the first squad into the gaping breach in the metal wall. There was no doubt that this was a ship. He elevated one of the initiates and carved a binding glyph on his forehead with a claw, then bestowed upon him a name, Oka. The elevated one went with the next batch of armed slaves, while Margus Sihanouk and his bodyguards remained at the entrance. Oka and his squad passed through the deck of the captain's bridge, barely surviving after a furious skirmish. Scattered bodies everywhere belonged to space marines. They all wore red armor, making it difficult at first glance to determine that they belonged to different chapters. Looking closely, Oka noticed that some had darker armor than others, and some had white jump packs, though even these were hard to see under the bloodstains. "Look at the left pauldrons," came Margast's voice in his head. "Yes, my lord," the cultist immediately replied, and his exclamation drew the attention of nearby squad members. The Astartes in light red armor had their left pauldrons painted white, with an emblem of two crossed red sabres pointing upwards, between which was a red skull. The dead men in darker armor bore a white, fanged skull, crowned with a coronet of black iron on their crimson pauldrons. It represented the metallic eagle used by the Loyalist chapters. Oka left the captain's bridge. His squad meticulously inspected every cabin until an archive was found, a chaotic jumble of old parchments, picts and data slates. Finding the needed ones, he began to read, feeling as though something was scratching inside his skull. Magast watches through his eyes. The Crimson Sabres are a Loyalist Space Marine chapter, whose founding is believed to have occurred sometime between the 35th and 36th millennia. Due to the lack of more detailed records, they are often attributed to the mysterious 13th Dark Founding. Information about their parent chapter has not survived, leading to various speculations on the matter. Each brother Astartes in this chapter adhere to their own theory, claiming descent from noble chapters such as the Ultramarines, Blood Angels, or Imperial Fists. Among the members of the Librarium and Reclusium, there were also those who believed the chapter's roots lay in some feudal world. They argued that this explained the Astartes' fascination with bladed weapons. It was not uncommon for proponents of this idea to go into battle wielding halberds or axes, paying homage to the tradition of fighting in close combat. The earliest mentions of the Crimson Sabres are records of battles in the early 36th millennium. The lack of details about their founding seems to be linked to two events, the fall of the planet Ragan and the Schism of Unity. After long searches, inquisitorial teams managed to trace several sources related to the chapter's activities during the Age of Apostasy. In one chronicle of the Silver Skulls, The participation of the Crimson Sabres in several battles was noted, their actions characterized as exemplary. The Astartes of the Silver Skulls volunteered to assist the Inquisition and delved into their records. The conclusion was that the chapter fully adhered to the Codex Astartes. In another source attributed to the Black Templars, it is mentioned that the Crimson Sabres took the lead in hunting down and annihilating the Xenos threat that invaded the Sala segments, while the Imperium was distracted by the war with the renegade Lord Gouge Van Deer. During the campaign on Danor IV, which lasted almost a year, it was the Sabres who earned the most honours, despite 6 chapters participating in the cleansing of the world. The campaign was led by Commander Virgil of the Blood Angels, who noted that the Sabres had proven themselves masters of lightning warfare and that their fighters were by no means inferior to the Blood Angels themselves. The only words of caution came from the Ultramarines librarian, Erigul, who believed the chapter was excessively eager to earn recognition. Later in his report he explained that such behaviour is natural for a small order that has the honour of fighting alongside such renowned chapters as the Blood Angels and the Ultramarines. The power armour of the Crimson Sabres was crimson red with white shoulder plates and a backpack. It is known that the Order strictly followed the recommendations of the Codex Astartes when choosing insignias and squad markings. However, exact details are now difficult to establish, as the Order was declared renegade and all mentions of it were destroyed. Some sources claim to have seen the heraldic symbols of sabres in several regions of the galaxy and even on their deceased homeworld, but the reliability of the information could not be verified. So, those with white shoulder pads are the Crimson Sabres, concluded Oka in a whisper. We need to find out who the second ones are. Leave it, the sorcerer interrupted him. Seek information about the homeworld. And he found it. The Bracatoa system was first colonized in the early stages of humanity's technological development. Despite its remoteness from Terra, a stable warp corridor allowed easy travel to this region. The star system was ideal, as it grouped a dozen habitable planets in short orbits. During the increasingly intensifying warp storms of the Age of Strife, all contact with the Bracatoa system was lost. Only thousands of standard years later did the storms dissipate, and exploratory fleets were able to penetrate this region once more, now identified as the galactic south of Segmentum Tempestus. The Imperium discovered that several planets still had human populations. The farthest planet was Reagan, with its twin moons, as well as Ramdan, Drogsh, and Rin's Death. Despite their proximity to each other, the planets had lost contact with all other human worlds. For them, the home of humanity had become merely a half-forgotten legend. All 3 worlds fell into decline and were ruled by feudal warlords, harsh but fair men who bravely fought against orcs and other Xenos raiders. Seeking to reclaim the mineral-rich system, the Imperium sent extensive colonization expeditions. The farthest planet, Reagan, was a shield world, as its orbit protected the other inhabited worlds. It was on Reagan that the recently founded Crimson Sabres erected a fortress monastery, which was named Dacovitum, translated from the local dialect as 10 Victories. Its 10 towers surpassed all mountain ranges in height, and orbital shipyards for the mighty fleet were built on Ragan's moons. During the Indomitus Crusade, the Crimson Sabres operated in the veiled region of Segmentum Pacificus and received rumours that the Bracatoa system was on the verge of collapse. Here the scroll ended, the burnt edges eloquently suggesting that the information had been attempted to be destroyed. On the next piece of parchment, there was a bit more information about the homeworld. It was specifically mentioned that the Crimson Sabres had once again established themselves on the neighbouring planet of Drogsh in order to restore their numbers. Throughout the following millennium, the chapter continued to fulfill their duty. Oka sensed his master's displeasure and frantically rummaged through the mountains of scrolls until he found a massive tome, the pages of which were made from the skin of some kind of animal. After the first dozen pages of randomly arranged symbols, a more or less understandable text followed, from which it became clear that someone named Cleveret Balok had secretly decided to keep his own journal, in which he chose to record everything the chapter tried to hide for various reasons. Judging by his notes, He was an ordinary rank-and-file Astartes, who was not distinguished by anything in particular. He hoped to preserve the true history of the Crimson Sabres, so that one day descendants would remember who they were and open their eyes to the truth. The narrative began with the date 556th year of the 38th millennium, and the events were titled as the Schism of Unity. The Barkatoa system still suffered from strange vortices in the immaterium. Although the storms had ceased before the beginning of the Great Crusade, warp routes were still considered dangerous. A region of abandoned ships and warp anomalies had formed not far from Barkatoa. This region was dubbed the Alley of the Chinaman. The new Sabres regularly conducted raids there for the exploration of the massive wrecks and target practice on void targets. It is said that this practice was imposed on them because they made the nearest planet their base. This was Reagan. One day, a space hulk appeared there, which was later named the Fusion. Even before this monstrosity had fully emerged from the warp, the astropathic choirs in the Barkatoa system began to receive desperate pleas for help. What emerged was a behemoth in every sense of the word, a conglomerate of numerous starships fused together. At the heart of the sprawling Fusion was an Imperial pilgrimage transport, whose multi-million-strong crew was struggling to fend off demon attacks. The entire available contingent of the Crimson Sabres immediately moved to assist, but they were not the only ones who responded to the distress signals. By strange coincidence, the Dark Angels also arrived in the system and requested permission to capture the space hulk on their own. The request was denied following the arrival of a Blood Angel strike cruiser, which also responded to the distress call. In the presence of the highest-ranking officer, the Blood Angels assumed overall command, but even as they did so, the Crimson Sabres followed their own protocols and launched boarding torpedoes toward the hulk. Soon the Space Marines were tearing into the enormous hull, hacking through bulkheads to reach the blood-soaked corridors. As soon as the volleys of bolter fire heralded contact with the enemy, the demons began to disappear. When the martial aspect of the mission was completed, the Astartes prepared to return to their barges, leaving the surviving colonists to the agents of the Inquisition, who were due to arrive shortly. In their zeal to follow procedures and their constant striving to prove themselves, the Sabres were not outdone by the two most renowned chapters. Although all three chapters are formally equal among themselves, the Dark Angels and the Blood Angels prided themselves on their long history and lineage and demanded corresponding respect. An unspoken tradition had been broken, and the Crimson Sabres were treated as presumptuous upstarts rather than as brothers in arms. Moreover, contrary to standard procedure, a Dark Angel's chaplain captured one of the pilgrim colonists and subjected him to brutal interrogations. But several squads of Crimson Sabres interrupted his work. They challenged him, claiming that the chaplain had been possessed by some warp disease given his actions, and a brief skirmish ensued. This led to casualties on both sides and the subsequent escape of the tormented hostage. The visibly enraged Dark Angels were ready to take immediate revenge, but hastened to disappear at the Inquisition's arrival. The first rift of discord. Somewhere far away, Shianak smirked. How will it grow? Will it shatter the wall of unity? Like the ripples of a stone cast into water, the Schism of Unity set off a chain of events that led to significant consequences. A few days later, communications from the Lords of Terror were delivered to Dacovitum, the contents of which were interpreted as a rebuke to the Crimson Sabres. It was a dry, cold reproach for their lack of due respect for the two illustrious chapters. What now? A dark stain has been cast upon the Sabres' reputation. The Order's High Council discussed the situation. Chapter Master Nigel was convinced that his warriors acted swiftly and correctly. So if there were any mistakes, they were certainly not from the Sabres. After all, they carried out one mission and served one emperor. He was also dismayed by the news that his Astartes feared additional reprimands from the Terran leadership, leading him to make an important declaration. Nigel announced that the Crimson Sabres were severing ties with their brotherly chapters, as well as with their presumed progenitors. Henceforth, they would act autonomously and rely only on the Codex Astartes and orders from the High Lords of Terror. According to the straightforward logic of the Chapter Master, their service to the Master of Mankind should not be spoiled by the influence of their companions. Thus, he sought to free the Crimson Sabres from erroneous judgments and future reprimands. At first the Sabres were proud of such determination, but gradually many began to be gnawed by self-doubt. Intolerant of dissent, Nigel forbade any mention of the Schism of Unity, and any discussion of the specific aspects of that operation in any form. Despite the chapter's unwavering convictions, severing ties with their supposed ancestors was a heavy burden. A significant portion of the Order's knowledge and chronicles had to be revised to ensure their history bore no mention of the founders. Time and again, the librarians and chaplains purged everything that fell under the prohibition. First, the statues, ancestral armour, and relics of Raggoth's ancient past that predated their Order's foundation were cleansed. Then, their fleet's cruisers were renamed, and the training regimen of the 10th Company was reconstructed anew. Only in the highest towers of the Dacovitum, where the Shrine of the Sword is located and accessible only to senior officers, did scrolls with the true former history remain. Under the stern leadership of Nigel, the Crimson Sabres zealously fulfilled their duty. If any embers of animosity lingered among the agents of the Adeptus Terra, they were soon forgotten. The Space Marines in red armour firmly established a reputation for swiftness and efficiency, and their behaviour was once again deemed impeccable. In essence, the Crimson Sabres were reborn as new defenders of the Imperium, unburdened by any ties to the distant past. However, something dark lurked in their souls. It was seemingly at that moment that he began writing his journal, hypothesized the sorcerer. Whoever this legionnaire was, he became the first spark of mounting contradictions. For over 100 years Nigel served as the chapter master. He knew no compromises, as he was well versed in the principles of the Codex Astartes and followed them rigorously. In pursuit of perfection, he instilled a new cult of extreme austerity within the Order's ranks. It was not enough to complete a mission successfully. It had to be done flawlessly, swiftly, properly detailed and documented. In the year 599 of the 38th millennium, the Sabres were summoned to quell an uprising that spread like wildfire across the hive world of Fornstadt. On the surface, they were drawn into a brutal confrontation with Chaos cultists. Nigel was killed in the 112th year of his tenure as chapter master. Before his death, he managed to expose the agents of the Alpha Legion, who were the architects of the rebellion. His position was taken by Arnok, yet the established traditions continued to live on. The Order became even more meticulous and demanding in their strict adherence to orders. Arnok became renowned as unyielding, and this epithet began to be attributed to all subsequent chapter masters. One of Arnok's first orders was to seal all entrances to the Shrine of the Sword. This not only concealed the evidence of the supposed imperfection, but also was his statement that the past was forever gone, and a new era had begun. More than ever striving to prove themselves, the Crimson Sabres conducted operations with indisputable precision and meticulously documented every campaign. From 613 to 621 years of the 38th millennium, the chapter participated in the wars for Bristow. Together with the units of the Stallan Imperial Guard, they managed to destroy 4 Eldar outposts, after which the Space Marines in red armour headed to other sectors, much to the dismay of the Guardsmen. Undoubtedly, in battle, the chapter was extremely effective and deserved trust, but when the battle ended, they turned into smug and fastidious individuals. After the battle, commanders received reports detailing every minutiae where Allied forces did not meet the proper standards. As for joint operations with other chapters, any deviation from the Codex resulted in even longer data summaries and endless lists of observed violations that did not conform to the tactical and organizational recommendations of Robert Guilliman. Although their attention to plans and details helped win many battles for the Imperium, it also alienated the Crimson Sabres from their allies. A glaring example was the joint actions of the Crimson Sabres and the Black Templars in the year 983 of the 33rd millennium against the abhorrent Xenos race Tau that thrived under the light of dead stars. After defeating the enemy, the two masters quarrelled and were ready to challenge each other to a duel, but this was avoided when the master of the Sabres, Grillock, referred to the Codex Astartes and stated that such behaviour was forbidden. "I would have slipped them a fake scroll with an order from the bureaucrats of Terra to jump one by one into the molten core of the planet and then watched the spectacle." Margast spat on the floor in disgust. Oka felt his master's acrid disdain and tried to distract himself by contacting the squad. He was informed about several skirmishes with mutants in the ship's corridors. There were no casualties. The cultist buried himself in the book again and continued reading. Numerous crusades had become something of a symbol of the Age of Redemption. The ecclesiarchy made tremendous efforts to instill faith in the hearts of people again and to wash away the sins of the Age of Apostasy with blood. New galaxy-wide crusades were declared wave after wave to push the boundaries of the Imperium further than ever before. The Crimson Sabres conducted their campaigns with extreme diligence and strove to further perfect the technique of rapid strikes and to achieve glory in battle. With ruthless efficiency, they completed mission after mission. Their victories expanded the Imperium's dominion over the Tempestus segments. They destroyed key enemy infrastructure, or captured heavily fortified positions to allow subsequent waves of the Imperial Guard to hold the conquered worlds. It was the Crimson Sabres who destroyed the Hrood on the border world of Nola, and paved the way for the liberation of the Reductus system from the Orcs. Despite heroism and numerous instances of self-sacrifice, Master Drabek became increasingly convinced that the reputation of his chapter was in question. On the papers of the Terran bureaucrats, the Crimson Sabres were listed as highly effective combat units in the army of the Imperium. However, on the battlefield, Drabek's assessment was more plausible, for many allies were disillusioned by the extremely critical and overly suspicious nature of the Space Marines in red armour. Though worlds were reclaimed under the dominion of the Imperium, the forces of humanity, in their zeal for longer and more complex campaigns, suffered many losses and found themselves excessively overstretched. And the galaxy, as is well known, is a dangerous place and does not tolerate a vacuum of power. During the campaign in the Veiled region, the insufficiently defended home sectors of the Astartes fell under threat. Fires of rebellion, Orc invasions, and new Xenos attacks began to flourish everywhere. It was at this time that the total collapse of the Krakatoa system occurred. Distant fleets of the Sabres received word from besieged monastery fortresses, but could not leave until the campaign was fully complete. By the time they had completed all missions and gathered the scattered companies, the invasion of Krakatoa was nearly over. In the year 187 of the 39th millennium, the chapter relocated to Drogsh, but it took many years to restore their numbers. During this time, they did not break their oaths or weaken their zeal, but resentment continued to grow in their ranks. For more than a standard millennium after the relocation, the Sabres continued to fight. Being isolated and increasingly detached from their brethren, they failed to recognize the growing hostility, saw only flaws in others, and were puzzled that their own striving for absolute adherence to the Codex Astartes had brought them little praise. Oka was distracted from reading by urgent negotiations in Oxay. 5 or 6 voices were shouting about losses and the need to retreat. "Do not be distracted from the task," the voice of the sorcerer admonished him. Standing in the same place, Margast waved his hand, and 2 more dozen armed cultists went to reinforce. Oka then resumed his work. In the year 928 of the 41st millennium, Inquisitor Fedric Koshin of the Ordo Hereticus sent a distress signal from the surface of the world Eumidia. Not that the Crimson Sabres were faithful allies of the Holy Ordos, but they could not ignore the signal. After all, they served the Golden Throne, and if the planet had become a dwelling for ruinous powers, it was their duty to cleanse it. The message was transmitted on a general channel, and soon other forces were preparing to provide support. The Lord's Hawk, the Blood Angels, and the Venerable Dark Angels promised to dispatch several squads to Umidia, but they retracted their commitment, refusing to fight alongside the Crimson Sabres. Had they acted differently, things might have turned out differently. Information about the planet was scarce. Notes in an old ship's log about the Crimson Sabres fleet passing nearby almost 3 millennia ago, its location on an outdated parchment star chart. The results of an imperial census conducted more than a standard century ago. There were even markers of ecclesiarchy activity. For thousands of years they incorporated the image of the god emperor into the system of local beliefs, eventually making rain and the rising sun his greatest manifestations. Scouts of the chapter reported an unusual procession on the planet's surface. They saw crowds of Umidia's inhabitants following a mysterious man whose face was hidden behind a bird-beaked mask. The entire procession was accompanied by dancing and chanting, and when the leader cast off his mantle, underneath was slate-grey armour bearing the golden symbol of the Inquisition, and beneath the mask was the same bird-like face. After reporting what they saw, the entire chapter's contingent deployed to the surface. The squads methodically identified the sources of demonic corruption and attacked immediately. The areas of battle gradually expanded, then merged, until they became one campaign of planetary genocide. Blinded by a bloody haze, the Crimson Sabres, in their meticulous and methodical manner, conducted a complete cleansing of the planet. When clarity of mind returned, they realized they had killed not Chaos cultists, but ordinary civilians who might have been celebrating a Ministorum-approved Saints' Day. In the official report, the Crimson Sabres claimed the population had been entirely enslaved by the cult of Valetu, a secret clique that worshipped ruinous powers. Inquisitors from the Order Malleus found no evidence of cult activity, but they did confirm the ferocity of the Sabres, which far exceeded the bounds of the Codex Astartes. The Crimson Sabres left Umidia long before the Inquisition's arrival, but the havoc they wreaked left a mark on their souls. Initially, none of them shared their experiences, each thinking the strange melancholy was merely the aftermath of the battle. Many found their pulse racing without reason, and their feelings of foreboding grew stronger. Certain warriors came to the horrifying realization that they could no longer clear their minds through blessed litanies and meditations, as the images and screams of the slain refused to leave their thoughts. Gradually the Sabres admitted to hearing voices. While some voices whispered pleas for help, others screamed and mocked. When the fleet made warp jumps, the cacophonies of voices became unbearable to the point that the Astartes fell to their knees and tried to cover their ears with their hands, hoping to stop hearing them. This same curse afflicted the current master, Sevastus Cranon. For a time, the master's mind teetered on the brink of madness. Part of him understood that the fleet must stop and return to Umidia, as the voices disrupted clear thinking. Cranon had no doubt about the righteousness of his actions, as the brutal killings followed the procedures clearly outlined in the Codex Astartes. Another part of him felt growing fear, for even minor heresies had seen witches and mutants burned, and here an entire chapter faced unknown corruption. Despite the voices' attempts to break him and alter his perception, Cranon made a decision. They halted their warp travel and set course for Umidia in search of the source of the corruption, but they ended up landing on the neighbouring planet called Demetra. Thus, the year 989 entered the chronicles of the chapter as the Terror on Demetra. The suspicions of Sevastus Cranon were confirmed, for the Crimson Sabres discovered a cult of the malign upon the surface of the Sisters' planet. But before this, the short journey through the Imperium seemed to them an eternity of torment, for there was no part of the fleet where they could hide from the voices, and the chapter was shrouded in a bloody veil of mysterious madness and paranoia. By the time they landed on Demetra, they were no longer the Crimson Sabres, but a horde of militant psychopaths who had perfected the art of lightning attacks and literally tore into settlements like a power blade into unprotected flesh. Systematically, they employed impressive orbital bombardments and then finished off the survivors with bolt gun fire and melee weapons. The Sabres killed with an efficiency that only superhumans created solely for war could achieve. But soon the Space Marines abandoned all approved plans and tactical decisions, focusing solely on one process: the slaughter. When it was all over, the blood-drenched Astartes realized that the voices had subsided, and the warriors who returned to the fleet found the long-awaited peace as their minds cleared. In his characteristic detailed manner, Master Kranon sent a report on the campaign to the Administratum, in which he stated that the neighbouring world of Demetra was indeed tainted due to its proximity to Umidia. The threat had been eradicated, and the Crimson Sabres were moving on to their next mission. Oka was distracted again. This time the screams and gunshots sounded somewhere very close. He looked out into the corridor, the far end of which was illuminated by flashes of flame. There were the clatters of stubbers and the roar of a flamethrower. He grabbed the tome and crawled through the ventilation shaft which led him to an old hangar. Here he climbed into a rhino with a torn-off roof. Returning was not an option, for the sorcerer would not have approved. Meanwhile, Margast sensed trouble and ordered his 2 bodyguards and all remaining cultists to go inside. Oka continued his reading. Shortly after the slaughter on Demetra, the voices began to return. Intercepted messages from the High Lords of Terror reached the Master, confirming his worst fears. The Crimson Sabres were declared excommunicate traitores. Now they were considered renegades, and any loyal fleet was obliged to open fire upon encountering them. Sevastus Kranon suspected this might happen, but had hoped for a thorough investigation, for he desired to explain that the actions of his chapter were harsh but necessary. Images of the slain appeared in his thoughts. Deep down, Kranon knew he would never be able to provide a coherent explanation for the madness that had gripped the chapter and the voices that haunted them. The ecclesiarchy would inevitably brand them as traitors and demon worshippers. Now, all the assets of the greatest empire in the galaxy would be turned against them. Considering the location, Kranon knew that he would not reach Drogsh before the Imperium. The destruction of their home world would be faster and more merciful than the cruelty that would undoubtedly befall those who remained in the fortress monastery. Countless chapter serfs, servitors, partially trained scouts, and many others would be put to death. Kranon thought of the old veterans who manned the defensive systems of the moons and the scout sergeants with whom he had long served. A violent death was an expected danger for any space marine, but all hoped to fall in battle in service to the Imperium. There was no honor in death from cyclonic torpedoes. Therefore, he summoned the librarians and dictated urgent messages to be sent to Drogsh. Whether they escaped or met some other fate, Kranon never knew. The next step was to address the chapter. Aboard the flagship Crimson Honor, the chapter master watched as his warriors gathered into orderly ranks and turned their eyes to him, and he began to speak. He spoke of all the hardships that had befallen the Crimson Sabres, the pain endured, the obligations to the Emperor, the warp and the voices. He acknowledged that their souls were cursed, and that the voices only fell silent after an unstoppable massacre. Another way to rid themselves of the haunting whispers was to die at the hands of the Inquisition, but that was clearly not an option. Ultimately, the chapter master proposed a path to a heroic death, as in the old legends, and said that anyone who wished could leave the ranks of the chapter right then. Beneath the vast vaulted domes, silence reigned, and then with a loud cry the Crimson Sabres raised their fists in support of Kranon. They would follow him and remain loyal to the Emperor. They would join him in the final campaign, even if it was the last daring strike into the heart of the enemy. Though they had become renegades, they retained the most precious thing: unity. He felt pride in his warriors and bowed his head, then ordered them to take their positions according to battle formations and set course for the Eye of Terror. With the proper Imperial access codes, the war fleet of the Crimson Sabres, consisting of 7 ships, slipped through several forbidden zones of the Cadian Gate, avoiding fortress worlds and orbital watch stations. But the Guardians of the Eye of Terror were ever vigilant, and just before entering the anomaly, the outcasts encountered an Imperial Fist strike cruiser and its escort destroyer. The opposing fleets exchanged volleys of torpedo salvos, and the Crimson Sabres repelled a brief but ferocious boarding action. It was not the battle Cranon had dreamed of, but due to their voice-filled minds, the Crimson Sabres reacted like predators sensing blood. At their disposal was the strike cruiser, Crimson Horizon. It sustained such severe damage that a trail of wreckage followed it, and it finally listed due to a damaged steering mechanism. However, the chapter managed to elude their pursuers and enter the most perilous region of space. In search of suitable targets, they wandered long through the streams of the ether, with barely restrained madness threatening to break out at any moment. It so happened that the Sabres descended upon the Eye of Terror with the unmatched fury of righteous, deranged maniacs. The first to experience their unbridled wrath were the distant planets partially engulfed by the swirling maelstrom. These were not demon worlds submerged in the warp's torrents, but rather sanctuaries for mutants and cultists. They served as excellent recruitment grounds for the numerous war bands of Chaos Space Marines. Pirate raiders gathered small armies here for raids on Imperial worlds, but all fell victim to the Sabres' fury. Amidst joyful whoops, they orchestrated a bloody massacre, which temporarily cleansed their minds and souls. Planet after planet, the Crimson Sabres carved their way deeper into the Eye of Terror, dispelling the cultist scum, but slowing down when faced with the traitor Astartes. Thanks to their numbers, they always emerged victorious. During one of the landings, they clashed with a berserker of Khorne, shattered blooded idols, and gunned down the surrounding Chaos worshippers. On a moon covered with lime and swamps, they encountered humanoid creatures with insect heads, wearing faded armor of some Astartes order. All were destroyed with the same ruthless efficiency. After each battle, the voices fell silent, and each warrior felt renewed. However, gradually the insistent whispers returned, merging into an increasingly maddening cacophony. During the long wars of heresy, there was not a single moment marking the chapter's turn to chaos. Rather, it was a gradual evolution. The fluid forces of the warp and heightened fears and desires of each warrior combined to transform them. In some cases, the changes were internal or too subtle to notice. In other cases, the mutation was much more radical. No one knew when the tomes of Chaplain Krark's liturgies changed, but in his fervent speeches there was no longer praise of righteousness and sacrifice in the name of the Imperium. Instead, speeches on the pursuit of power, individual rights, and omnipotent force took their place. The eyes of one Space Marine blazed red during bursts of fury, while another's teeth turned into sharp fangs. Some returning from the battlefields found their own bones protruding from their armor, forming new ribbed structures and horns sprouting through their helmets. The largest horns grew on Chapter Master Cranon. In the ever-changing foggy world of Drabloin, Sergeant Drasnicht developed unusual foresight abilities, and a third eye opened on his forehead. They accepted all changes with stoic fatalism. In the end, upon entering the Eye of Terror, the Crimson Sabres sang their death hymns and resigned themselves to this being their final campaign. It no longer mattered how severe the mutations they had undergone were, for in the end death awaited each of them. Meanwhile, they delved ever deeper into the Eye, scavenging every new planet, moon or drifting spaceship in search of new victims. If any signs of life were found, they were immediately attacked. The librarians and chapters diligently documented each battle. At least, that was what they thought. When they decided to recheck the records, they discovered reports of several dozen battles, and the incoherent babble that the voices whispered in their heads. Cranon took this news hard, for he still hoped to restore justice by sending detailed reports of their actions to Terra. The Imperium could learn something about the noble, heroic sacrifice of the chapter they had wronged. He did not hope for forgiveness, but did not want the Crimson Sabres to be forgotten. Now, ironically, the only messages the Sabres transmitted were the ravings of madmen. Undoubtedly, this would convince the Imperium that they were truly possessed and lost. Although the passage of time was distorted, Cranon knew that 3 solar days had passed since their last battle. They had not found enough enemies on the latest barren planet to silence the voices for long. The Master looked desperately at the surviving fighters. He had lost more than 200 Astartes, and without a homeworld and neophytes there was no way to replenish the losses. There were still about 50 members of the chapter who had not been seen for several days. At least one of them, reportedly, had torn out of his power armor, transforming into a vile creature prowling the lower decks of the Crimson Honor. Whatever it was, it needed to be hunted down. Crannon suspected that some of his librarians had undergone some horrible transformation, and his own blood brother was locked in a cell, refusing to speak to him, calling him a bloodthirsty traitor. Even the fleet's ships were affected by the warp, with Gothic spires bending, spiked railings protruding outward, and the corridor to the flagship's command bridge becoming organic. Crannon was in despair. At that moment he decided that he no longer wanted unheralded martyrdom. He just wanted to live. The Master gathered around him trusted officers and those chapter leaders who best resisted the curse. This close circle included Company Masters Rangold and Sharden, Veteran Sergeant Drasnift, Chaplain Krag, and Chief Librarian Manol. Only to them did Crannon reveal his new vision of the situation, a desire to find a way to end the curse and ensure the future existence of the chapter. In many ways, this was the final acknowledgement of their rebellion against the Imperium. Each of the gathered leaders felt a pang of regret, for they had been prepared to sacrifice their lives in battle, following Crannon out of a sense of duty and oath, aspects that had entirely controlled their lives for many standard years. But now all seemed in vain. Each officer voiced their own version, justifying that they no longer aspired to be martyrs for those who had betrayed them. No one mentioned that inner voices had long been spewing lengthy accusatory speeches along similar lines. Even Crannon. They believed they were tempering their minds and had made themselves believe that the whispers did no harm and that the decisions were entirely their own. Thus began a new phase where the growing circle of confidants started planning further steps to involve the remaining part of the Order. They also decided how to deal with those who wished to remain loyal to the Imperium. Once all stages of the conspiracy were meticulously worked out, Crannon gave the order to prepare. At that moment, the Order had spent 10 long solar days without battles, and then a space wanderer was discovered, and Crannon unleashed his bloodthirsty psychopaths on the entire mutated rabble that could be on that ship. The wanderer was so enormous that it took 3 days to cleanse it. On board were hundreds of Chaos pilgrims, luring victims into the Eye of Terror. When the sated Space Marines returned from their latest slaughter, they were immediately summoned to the Great Hall on board the Crimson Blade. Squad after squad, company after company, they lined up, awaiting the arrival of their brothers and their leader. Their armor was slick with blood, and entrails hung from the blades of the glaives, whose deaths had silenced the voices for a while. Crannon addressed his battle brothers, asking them how long they had fought in the Eye of Terror. He once told the Order that they were brave enough to follow him into the most dreadful place in the galaxy. Now he asked them to muster the courage to follow him further, and then he added that he no longer served the Imperium. Instead, he would seek a cure for the madness that had taken root in their minds. For several dozen Space Marines, this was the final blow. They heard words of incitement to rebellion and, looking around, saw what they had once sworn to destroy. The War Council had previously identified potential loyalists and positioned their supporters nearby with weapons already targeted. Fewer fights broke out than expected, and the battle ended quickly. Once again, their lives changed forever. Another line was crossed, another decision was made from which there was no turning back. So they stepped beyond the brink and chose the path of damnation. The Crimson Sabres died, the Crimson Slaughter was born. The cultists stopped, for the scorched body of one of the Word-Bearer's bodyguards had fallen not far from his lair. In the light of the flickering lumens, he saw the giant whose flesh was adorned with ritual symbols. Oka glanced towards the passage and saw a monstrosity fused from flesh and metal. One hand ended in the nozzle of a flamer, while the other resembled a giant pincer. Margast Sihanouk examined the ship with his inner sight. Somewhere not far from his subordinate was a large black cloud with pulsating blood-red veins. He disliked this image in the warp most of all, because he did not like those to whom it was attached. The bearer of such an essence could feel only one thing: rage. Without hesitation, Margast Sihanouk stepped inside.